Before we get started, this is the obligatory spoiler warning that you'll see before every Outer Wilds YouTube video. If you haven't finished or even played this game before, please do so before watching this video. Playing through Outer Wilds blind is the best single player gaming experience that I have ever had, and I would hate to spoil that for you before you've had the chance to play it yourself. So, this is your final chance to click off now before I go ahead and spoil the whole thing for you. How the Nomai shapes the story of Outer Wilds is something that doesn't get talked about all that often. Most people focus on the story itself and unravelling the mystery of the Eye of the Universe, but the individual Nomai themselves, they often go unnoticed, with each having their own relationships, stories, and roles that shaped everything we experience in the game. Today, I'll be exploring how their actions connect and tying their stories back to the larger narrative of Outer Wilds, without diving too deep into the finer details of the plot itself. But hey, if you guys enjoy this kind of deep dive, I'd love to do one in the future focusing on the story as a whole. But anyways, without further ado, because there's been way too much ado already, let's get into it. The story of the Nomai, as we know them, starts with the crash of the vessel into Dark Bramble. Now here there are three key characters that we are introduced to who, along with a few others, will become known as the First Generation. These are Ascol, Felix, and Anona. Ascol was the leader of his Nomai clan and the captain of their vessel. Felix was the first to notice a signal from the Eye and identified that it was older than the universe. He wanted to delay a moment so they could message other wandering Nomai clans of their find and where they were going, but Ascol ordered Anona to warp immediately out of fear that the signal may be lost forever. Before the warp, Felix and Anona checked that the warp core and navigation systems were working fine. However, as we know, the Eye's signal had been distorted by Dark Bramble, and the vessel became trapped within it. The last message left behind on board was from Felix. "This is Ascol's vessel. Something went badly wrong during our warp and our vessel is mortally wounded. We need help as quickly as possible." 3 escape pods were launched. The first of these contained Felix, Thatch, Plume, and Koza, who crash landed on Brittle Hollow. The second of these 3 pods carried Anona, Coleus, Melore, Roos, and Burr to the surface of Ember Twin, where they were forced to hurry underground. On board the final pod were Ascol, Din, Sekka, and a few other Nomai whose pod was never to leave Dark Bramble. It had become lost within its warped space-time, and although they took shelter at the crash site for a brief period, the anglerfish of the planet attacked more and more consistently until the Nomai of Escape Pod 3 were forced to begin their return to Ascol's vessel to await rescue. They would never make it to the vessel, as Dark Bramble's contorted seas had made the vessel's signal appear to be coming from multiple different sources simultaneously. With the beacon fading and the Nomai running low on oxygen, they made their way to the closest source of the signal, which turned out to be one of these seeds, although far too small to fit through. These ill-fated Nomai gathered around the seed and left a recording for any future Nomai who might discover their fate. One by one, these Nomai travellers passed away as their oxygen slowly depleted. Over 200,000 years later, at the time of the Harthian civilization, Ascol's story had passed into myth among the remaining Nomai clans, with very few still remembering the truth. While a few modern Nomai are hurrying for safety in an increasingly dim universe as the stars of the night sky go out one by one, they mention the story of Ascol's disappearance. Bromi mentions Ascol's vessel as an old myth that his grandfather used to tell him, the disappearance of Ascol. Hyssop claims, "That's no myth, friends. Ascol's clan existed and their story was real," even saying, "My clan's ancestors searched for Ascol's clan for a long time, but in the end none of them were ever seen again," seeming to be the only Nomai who remembers the truth to the legend. Of course, if a skull had taken only a moment to notify other Nomai clans of where they were headed, they may indeed have been rescued before their oxygen was depleted, and they could have led their entire civilization to the Eye. Not all of the Nomai, however, were so unlucky as to face such a fate. When the second pod landed on Ember Twin, the Nomai on board began to search the caves for a suitable site to inhabit, as the surface was far too hot due to its proximity with the sun to be lived on. Burr noted that he could hear both the distress beacons from the other escape pods, but he didn't think they had landed on Ember Twin with them. Melloray, who was Coleus's mentor, and also Thatcher's aunt, who, remember, landed on Brittle Hollow in Escape Pod 1, located a site that would later become the Sunless City. Coleus was instrumental in guiding Nomai from the crashed escape pod through the cave system to the Sunless City. He left behind directions for other Nomai to follow, and many years later for the hatchling to follow too. Russ kinda just found some rocks in a cave and was never heard from again, so yeah, that's basically him. Some of the Nomai also began construction on the High Energy Lab, which becomes very important later. Meanwhile, on Brittle Hollow, Thatcher's aunt was Melloray, who was on Ember Twin at this time. Thatch urged the others to seek shelter from Hollow's lantern, which rained fiery meteors at the planet's surface. Plume proposed building a temporary settlement below the surface of Brittle Hollow. After this settlement was built, the Nomai survivors were in very different states. Some, like Thatch and Felix, began recording everything they knew about the Eye of the Universe. Felix also noted that the other two escape pods must be at least structurally intact, as she could hear their distress beacons. Others, like Plume and Koza, mourned the loss of their less fortunate loved ones. Plume prayed for the survival of two missing Nomai, one of whom was his brother. My brother wasn't in Escape Pod 1 with us. Was he in Pod 2 or Pod 3? Was he able to board an escape pod at all? The other that Plume prayed for was a Nomai named Keek. The pain of your absence is sharp and haunting, and I would give anything not to know it. I can only hope that you are safe, Keek, wherever you are. While Koza expressed their sadness at missing their partner Foley, saying, I am unsure how to survive in this place without you. I am unsure how to be me without you. Thatch commented on the tragedy of their situation and how much he missed his Aunt Melloray. The Nomai of Escape Pod 1 also wondered as to the nature of their crash and whether there must have been an issue with the vessel before the warp. The settlement that these Nomai had created was along Brittle Hollow's equator, which was far too unstable to continue living on. Plume suggested building a new permanent settlement at the northern glacier, stating, We're here because the Eye's signal called to us and we followed. If we're here to find it, we need not merely survive, but thrive. While Thatch originally opposed the idea, thinking they should remain close to the pod in case they were rescued, he changed his mind to support Plume. Felix suggested using gravity crystals to create a path to the new settlement. This new settlement would be called the Hanging City and would later become host to schools, homes, and the Black Hole Forge. Next came potentially the biggest development for the Nomai yet in the time they had spent stranded in the solar system: the construction of the gravity cannon, which could launch ships into orbit without consuming fuel. This finally reconnected the Nomai of Brittle Hollow and Ember Twin. While there is nothing confirming who was involved in the construction of the gravity cannon, I think it's fair to presume that Felix would have had some amount of involvement with it. He was the first to utilise the power of gravity crystals and proposed the idea of using them to navigate to the northern glacier. So I think it would be fair to surmise that the massive cannon powered by gravity crystals would have seen some involvement from Felix. With the separated groups of Nomai united, they could begin to focus on what brought them here to this solar system in the first place: the Eye of the Universe. Their first task was building an Eye of the Universe locator on the Atoll Rock, Timberhearth's moon, to track the signal from the Eye. This locator was built by Felix, Cassiver, and Burr. So Felix was from Escape Pod 1 that landed on Brittle Hollow, Burr was from Escape Pod 2 that landed on Ember Twin, and Cassiver is the first second generation Nomai that we learn of, as he was born on Brittle Hollow. Privet, who was Felix's apprentice, helped to calibrate the locator. She was also born on Brittle Hollow, much like Cassiver. Unfortunately, this early locator was unable to locate the Eye of the Universe, rotating randomly and never settling on one location when asked to locate it. Another locator was built on Twin's south pole, this one capable of locating the quantum moon, which would orbit every planet in the solar system simultaneously unless observed, in which case it would orbit just one at random. Mellaray realised that sometimes the locator would be unable to find the quantum moon, spinning randomly like the eye locator on the Atoll rock, and proposed the idea that there must be a sixth location that the moon travels to. Using the following 3 quantum rules, it became tradition for Nomai, when they came of age, to make a pilgrimage to the moon's 6th location, where the reflection of the eye of the universe could be seen in the sky. The first of these quantum rules is the lesson of quantum imaging, found on Giant's Deep at the Tower of Quantum Trials, although I couldn't find anything to connect a specific Nomai to this rule or the tower. The second rule was discovered in Twin, and is the rule of quantum entanglement. This involves Coleus and Mellaray, 2 of the first generation Nomai who inhabited Twin. Coleus found a wandering rock fragment in the planet's caves with Mellaray when suddenly her lantern went out and he disappeared without a trace. Mellaray, worried for Coleus' safety, organised a search and Nomai from the Sunless City went looking for him. It turns out that the rock had transported Coleus to a room with no entrance and no exit. However, he figured that he had become entangled with the quantum rock fragment when it was no longer being observed, and he was able to free himself by entangling with it again and being taken to freedom. While Mellaray did credit him with discovering a new quantum rule, she also urged him to try not to disappear again. The final rule is taught at the Tower of Quantum Knowledge on Brittle Hollow, and explains that accessing the moon's 6th location is tied to the northern pole of the moon. There was also a shard on top of the tower which both Thatch and Plume theorised must be related to the moon. Bells was a Nomai very involved with the Tower of Quantum Knowledge, as she would teach other Nomai their final lesson before their trip to the quantum moon. One particularly important pilgrim that Bells helped to guide was Solanum, who we'll be hearing much more about later on. These next 2 things mostly happen simultaneously in the Nomai's timeline, but they're both equally important to each other, and these are the second eye locator in the Southern Observatory on Brittle Hollow, and the finding of the negative time interval at the Black Hole Forge and the High Energy Lab. Now, I'll talk about the Southern Observatory first, then the negative time interval, and then afterwards I'll tie them both together and hopefully everything will make sense. At the Southern Observatory, the Nomai continued to focus on their goal of finding the eye of the universe. After the failure of the eye locator on the Atoll rock, it was clear that they had to construct one far larger.
More powerful.
This was agreed on by both Felix and Cassava. Plume became responsible for its construction, along with Privet, who, remember, helped to calibrate the first locator on the Atoll rock. Unfortunately, this second locator was not sophisticated enough to find the eye of the universe. Privet suggested that they should discontinue the search method entirely, and Mallow suggested using a probe to find the eye visually. Meanwhile, at the Black Hole Forge, Poke was working on recreating warp travel. Her mentor was Anona, one of the leading Nomai that crashed on Twin. Anona was responsible for the original invention of the advanced warp core, which enabled Nomai vessels to traverse the universe. Although Anona had passed away by this time, he had shared parts of his designs with Poke when she was very little. She would use this knowledge to recreate a primitive form of warp travel at the Black Hole Forge with help from Clary and Root. This was particularly helpful on Brittle Hollow, as Nomai who fell into the black hole at its centre could now quickly warp back to Brittle Hollow. This was the purpose of the White Hole Station. This was not, however, the most incredible discovery Poke would make. Poke found out that after warping back to Brittle Hollow, she actually exited the warp pad on Brittle Hollow slightly before she had entered the warp pad on the White Hole Station. She sent the records of this negative time interval to Pi and Ramey, who tested and confirmed Poke's findings at the High Energy Lab. Now this is where the connection between the Southern Observatory and the High Energy Lab comes into play. Connoy was a Nomai working at the Southern Observatory who had also visited the High Energy Lab on Twin and knew of their research. He suggested that finding the eye using a probe could work with the new technology developed over there. Although the odds of finding the eye using a probe were minuscule, they could theoretically fire an infinite number of probes over and over again, sending the data back in time using this negative time interval, and then refiring it in a different direction until it found the eye. From the probe's perspective, it would have been trying to find the eye for hundreds of years, but from the Nomai's perspective, it would only take 22 minutes, the exact amount of time for the probe to reach the eye of the universe. This plan had only one issue. Conway pointed out that they would need to be able to create a 22-minute negative time interval for the probe to work, and so far, they hadn't been able to create a negative time interval longer than a fraction of a second. To increase a negative time interval, they would need power. A lot of power. How are they going to make this power? By blowing up the sun. In Pi's own words, science compels us to explode the sun. That's how deeply embedded the Nomai philosophy of scientific advancement and discovery was. They lived by only two tenets: to seek out and to explain. They were literally willing to decimate this entire solar system in the pursuit of the eye of the universe. They knew that this would destroy the early forms of Harthian life. Although that isn't to say that all of the Nomai were heartless. Psycad, who we'll learn about more later, he was Coleus' apprentice. He actually chose to move mining sites on Timberhearth in order to protect that early Harthian species. And Idea, despite being responsible for building the sun station, which would blow up the sun, actually opposed its construction based on moral and ethical grounds. But nonetheless, the majority of the Nomai civilization had reached the conclusion that this was the only way forward if they wanted to continue advancing scientifically. This huge, colossal undertaking would become known as the Ash Twin Project. The Ash Twin Project was comprised of 6 different key sub-projects, with each having a varying level of complexity. It's worth bearing in mind that these mostly all happened at the same time as each other, so although I'll go through them one at a time, that's only because this video would be really confusing if I explain them all like this. Anyways, these 6 key projects were the need for an advanced warp core, not just the primitive ones Poke had already made, construction of warp towers on Ash Twin, need for protection of the Ash Twin project from the supernova, construction of a cannon which could launch the probe to the outskirts of the solar system in 22 minutes, finding a way to bring Nomai into the cannon's loop if necessary as a failsafe, and a sun station must be created to cause the sun to go supernova early in its life cycle in order to power this whole thing. The High Energy Lab found during their testing that an advanced warp core would be required to handle all the energy used to create the 22-minute negative time interval. The recreation of the advanced warp cores that Poke's mentor Anona invented was a relatively uneventful process. There was some discussion around whether it would be better to get the broken advanced warp core from the vessel on Dark Bramble, with Psycad suggesting that as Coleus and Malore had discovered that anglerfish were blind from the skeleton of one on Ember Twin, they could use this information to get the advanced warp core back from the vessel. Poke could then have an original core to make developing the new one much easier. However, Coleus reminded him that this hypothesis had never been tested on living anglerfish. Clary suggested that Poke should build a new advanced warp core as she was Anona's apprentice. After this, it was decided that Poke shall create a new advanced warp core, rather than trying to salvage the broken one. As for Poke, she felt a certain strangeness about working on a new advanced warp core, as it made it feel all the more real that Anona was gone and she was no longer his very young apprentice. She even felt weird being in control of the Black Hole Forge when that position also once belonged to him. Nonetheless, she was successful in developing the new advanced warp core. When it was ready to be installed, she asked for more time as she thought she could make it more robust, but familiar with her perfectionist nature, Clary told Yarrow to install it anyways. Yarrow was a sort of project manager for the Ash Twin project, overseeing everything, so you'll hear a lot more from him throughout. The construction of warp towers on Ash Twin was necessary to facilitate efficient travel between the various projects. In a conversation between Erno and Psycad, Erno explained that the towers would be built using material taken from the Ash Twin, likely the material that was excavated to create space for the Ash Twin project itself. Yarrow, Raimi, and Coleus were responsible for excavating Ash Twin, and Coleus made sure to relocate all the subterranean plants that they discovered while they were digging. While Phlox was involved in the design of the towers, Poke built the warp cores for them, just as she had with the warp cores on Brittle Hollow and the White Hole Station. Throughout this process, she maintained a good relationship with almost everyone. She even encouraged Clary, her sister, to pursue Yarrow romantically, teasing her about it occasionally. Clary, along with Root, delivered the first of Poke's warp cores to Yarrow personally, where Yarrow asked her on a date to the White Hole Station and their romantic relationship began. The only person that Poke failed to get along with was Cassiver, who you'll remember as he built the Attlerock eye locator with Felix. These arguments were primarily prompted by Cassiver's negative attitude towards finding the eye, as he consistently doubted its possibility. Cassiver worked on Giant's Deep and frequently accused Poke of building the warp core for Giant's Deep last intentionally. Poke would reply by blaming this warp core's slow production on the fact that Cassiver would interrupt her constantly to ask for updates. It even got to a point that Clary and Yarrow had to act as mediators between their constant arguments. A protective shell would need to be built to protect the Nomai inside the Ash Twin project from the supernova long enough to project that data back in time by 22 minutes. In order to remain structurally sound, it couldn't have a physical entrance or exit. This placed more importance on Poke's warp core towers, as this would be the only way to access the Ash Twin project. Roots tested various ores in Hollow's lantern to see how long they would last in direct heat, and decided that the ore found on Timber Hearth would be the best material to use. Cycad, Airno, and Coleus identified mining sites on Timber Hearth and mined the ore that the Ash Twin project shell would be constructed with. Cycad was fascinated with the not-yet land-dwelling Hearthian life, and as I mentioned earlier, had everyone move from mining site 2A to 2B in order to protect their habitat. Coleus was, from my research, the only first-generation Nomai still alive at this time. Everything is quite ambiguous in this game, and nothing's really concrete, but I think it's extremely likely that he was the only first-generation Nomai still alive. While others like Felix had probably passed away by this point, it still cannot be said definitively, as he may well have still been teaching at the school in the Hanging City. As for Coleus, he was already a geologist before their clan had been stranded in the solar system, and so he fit perfectly in his role for this project and as Cycad's mentor. Yarrow and Raimi were responsible for building the protective shell on Ash Twin with the ore that the others had mined, and Airno visited them once the shell was finished to help with the final safety check. If Raimi sounds familiar, it's because she was mentioned earlier in relation to the High Energy Lab, as she worked with Pi to experiment with the negative time interval that Poke had discovered. Avens, a Nomai who we haven't come across yet, suggested building the orbital probe cannon in orbit around a celestial body, as this would circumvent the need to escape gravity's pull. Cassiver added to this, suggesting that Giant's Deep should be the celestial body of choice, saying, "It's furthest from the sun, so it would provide the best angles for launch, and it's moonless." Cassiver and Avens worked together on building the orbital probe cannon at the construction yard on Giant's Deep. Daz and Konoi then helped Cassiver lift the components into orbit for assembly. During this process, one of the cyclones pulled a component beneath the current. Spire built a model at the Southern Observatory to explain that a secondary type of cyclone with an opposite rotation will actually pull things down towards the planet's centre rather than lifting them out of the atmosphere. Privet, who was last involved in the Southern Observatory locator, was responsible for installing the probe tracking system in the cannon. She made sure it would record each launch's flight trajectory and would submit all relevant data automatically to the Ash Twin project. Once the location was found, Privet would be the first to see the coordinates and would immediately alert Yarrow and Raimi. Avens and his partner Mallow were responsible for firing the cannon. Daz had anticipated them being overly eager and told Cassiver to give them a lower maximum power level so they would not destroy the cannon on launch. Nonetheless, Mallow and Avens ignored the power setting given to them and used so much power that the cannon was destroyed entirely upon launch, with the probe tracking module being sent flying into the underwater depths of Giant's Deep. A team on Giant's Deep, consisting of Daz and Phlox, created a system of memory storage masks and statues to act as a failsafe. If something were to go wrong, then they would activate, pairing a statue with a mask and enable the Nomai to go back in time and fix whatever happened. On the other hand, even if everything went according to plan, Yarrow says that they would still be useful for enabling the Nomai to gather more data before shutting down the Ash Twin project. Daz was Cassiver's husband and Avens' brother. He built the memory storage masks, while Phlox, Plume's son, you'll remember Plume from the first generation of Brittle Hollow, set up the statue workshop to sculpt the memory statues. Although there's a lot of crossover, they both helped each other out on their projects a lot. Daz and Cassiver had a discussion about the memory statues. Cassiver thought that sending memories back in time is the same thing as sending a being back in time, as the end result is identical. Daz considered sending memories back in time and physically going back in time to be different. In order to power the entire project, the Nomai had to succeed in speeding up the sun's life cycle and causing it to prematurely go supernova. This was the sun station's purpose. Idea firmly opposed the idea to build the sun station, as he believed that the destruction of an entire star system went against every standard the Nomai hold themselves to and was too severe of a cost to obtain the eye's location. Pi disagreed with Idea, and they constantly argued about whether the exploding of the sun was morally justified or not. Pi believed that pushing new technology further than ever before was a defining characteristic of their species, and she would regularly make puns about the sun's pending destruction. Idea thought that Pi's mission statement of science compelling them to explode the sun was morbid and lacked ethics. Their arguing got to a point that Yarrow suggested they should both spend time away from the sun station, to which they agreed. Unfortunately, the culmination of all these years of work for the Nomai, the results of generations of effort, was nothing. The sun station failed. It wasn't even close to being able to bring about a supernova. For Idea, I view him very much as an Oppenheimer-like character, only if Oppenheimer's atomic bombs had failed and the nuke was never invented. He says, "We're well, Yarrow, though disappointed. I may have disagreed with exploding the sun, but I never wished the device would fail. I'd hoped our terrible work was finished." These are the last words we ever hear from Idea. Pi seemed devastated by the extent to which the sun station failed, saying, "It fired, but it failed. The sun barely responded. There were infinitesimally small surface level changes, but they were barely visible, even to the third eye. The sun station is useless. It will never, and could never, cause the sun to explode." Before she had a chance to theorize a new approach to their energy issue, Yarrow told her to return to Ash Twin, as Spire had seen the Interloper approaching the star system, and they were eager to investigate something new. Sent to investigate the Interloper were Pi, Poke, and Clary. Pi and Poke went below its surface through a fissure to investigate the source of a strange energy reading that they were getting, while Clary stayed behind with the ship to prevent it from freezing. At the Interloper's core, Pi and Poke found a stone casing containing matter that would be lethal upon contact. This matter was ghost matter, and it was under tons of pressure. As the Interloper was getting closer to the sun, it was becoming less and less stable. Pi and Poke saw the danger that this posed, and while Poke was sent to warn the other Nomai in the solar system, Pi courageously opted to stay a while longer in the Interloper's core so she could learn more about the alien matter and what could hopefully be done to stop it. Clary became worried for Pi and Poke, as they had stopped contacting her after they descended into the fissure. She was about to leave the shuttle to search for her friends when the casing of ghost matter ruptured and left the entire solar system immediately blanketed in a deadly layer of ghost matter. Poke never made it far enough to warn anyone of the danger before she was killed. Clary's remains can still be found in the shuttle and the Interloper, now encased in ice. Pi's remains can still be found by the ruptured casing at Interloper's core. Although she had spent her life dedicated to a cause that many of the Nomai thought was unethical, she died as she lived, in the pursuit of scientific advancement. Privet had left the orbital probe cannon to visit Idea on the sun station after it had failed, as she feared that he may have felt responsible. It's unknown whether Privet was able to reach Idea to console him before the Interloper's core erupted. Idea's body still remains at the bottom of the sun station, facing the sun that he had spent his life trying to destroy. Cassiver, Daz, Avon's, and Mallow's remains can still be found at the construction yard on Giant's Deep. Even the children of the Nomai also faced the same unfortunate fate. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, the Nomai's 100-year-long journey to the signal older than the universe itself was over. Now, although that may be the story of Outer Worlds wrapped up, this wouldn't be a character breakdown if I didn't also explain the children of the Nomai, who don't particularly tie into the game's key events, which is why they haven't been properly mentioned yet. One of them is potentially the most important Nomai that we learn of throughout the entire game, and I'll fully unpack her importance at the end. The children we know of, Levi, Lamy, Tajit, Ilex, and Solanum, grew up in the Sunless City on Embertwin. We see that they played on the anglerfish skeleton and, according to Coleus and Malore's research, even introduced a rule that whoever was the anglerfish had to wear a blindfold, which was much to Coleus's delight. Levi and Lamy, whose aunt was Pi, and Tajit moved to Giant's Deep, where they would sometimes get into trouble together, arguing as to whether they should sneak into the statue workshop and spy on the tests being conducted. Ilex went to school on the Hanging City and wanted to prioritise building a new vessel to reconnect with other Nomai clans, instead of building the Ash Twin project. We see the influence that the adult Nomai have had on her shaping her own views. Poke told Ilex about the fact she was making an advanced warp core, and Yarrow explained that the Ash Twin project would use a lot of resources. Ilex came to the conclusion that the advanced warp core would be better used in a new vessel than in the Nomai's project. Finally, potentially the most important Nomai that we encounter throughout the entire game, Solanum, both wiped out by the Interloper and its only survivor. As a child in the Sunless City, Solanum visited the Ice Shrine district and doubted whether the Eye was worthy of worship. Her father told her that many Nomai died in following the Eye's signal, and she wondered if perhaps their deaths were the will of the Eye. However, as she grew up, her views changed. She believed that maybe the Eye wasn't malicious, as it may have no wishes or desires at all. Maybe it just simply was. It didn't have any great, deep meaning, and to Solanum, this wasn't so bad. Just like every other Nomai when they became of age, Solanum made her own pilgrimage to visit the Quantum Moon. She learned the first rule at the Tower of Quantum Trials, and the next two from Bells at the Tower of Quantum Knowledge. Following this, Solanum set out to the Quantum Moon, landing on its south pole. Shortly after her landing, while she was travelling to the North Pole on foot, the ghost matter from the Interloper wipes out all Nomai in the solar system. However, due to the weirdness of quantum space, Solanum was technically present at all of the Moon's possible orbital locations at the same time. Every version of Solanum that was orbiting one of the 5 planets in the solar system was killed in this event. However, one version of her survived, as the ghost matter couldn't reach her, the one that orbited the eye of the universe. This is why I say she was both killed and survived. The hatchling can actually make the same journey as her, and find her both dead at the main 5 locations, and alive at the North Pole of the Moon's 6th location. It is highly likely that due to the inconsistent and uncertain laws of quantum physics, time has not passed for her at the same conventional rate that it has for the hatchling. This explains why she is still alive hundreds of thousands of years later. In a rudimentary conversation, Solanum even acknowledges that she may not be entirely alive, without the greatest deal of concern. Solanum even seems surprisingly calm at the sight of an entirely new species before her eyes. She seems to be well educated enough to have prepared herself for even the strangest of situations. Finally, the hatchling is left with no choice but to disembark and continue on their own journey to find the Eye, leaving Solanum to be by herself once again. Solanum is a fascinating character, and the only living Nomai that we as the hatchling ever get to interact with. She has two great quotes that really stuck with me particularly. It's tempting to linger in this moment, while every possibility still exists, but unless they are collapsed by an observer, they will never be more than possibilities. We do not have much connection, you and I. Still, this encounter feels special. I hope you won't mind if I think of you as a friend.